where does home rule come from, and why, is it part of the tradition of being in New Jersey? And so I'll get as far as I can with this, and I would like you to think of this more like some kind of a round table. If you have suggestions or corrections or anything else, feel free to bring them to my attention. I will try to post this talk on our website, the Bergen County Historical Society's website, so you can have another chance to sort of read it or contemplate it. But I think it is a topic of great sort of moment or interest. This is very much the right time and place to consider the topic of home rule, a political legacy or luxury. It is certainly the right time, for as you well know, New Jersey has the highest per capita property taxes in the nation, which funds budgets in 616 school districts, 566 municipalities, and 21 counties, all in this little state of ours. We decided to offer a historical perspective on home rule almost a year ago as a special legislative session meant to enact property tax reforms. We're now hearing some of the conclusions of that meeting. This special legislative session was actually called specifically to consider the manner in which government provides for the support of free public schools, a topic almost as old as the state, the sharing of services and regionalization at all levels of government, controlling the costs of public employee benefits, and finding the best method for property tax reform, whether that be state constitutional amendments or some people have proposed a citizens' property tax constitutional convention. Now, we've met in the right place, for here, this very building, history is literally staring us right in the face. This old schoolhouse speaks directly to the origins of home rule. The neighborhood it served, much like the adjoining old stone church, was not constrained by any civic boundaries, but crossed onto both sides of the Saddle River. In other words, the school district that this building served was not confined to the township on this side of the river. Actually, by the late 1800s, students from 4 separate townships attended school here. Okay? This was of little consequence back then, for precincts or townships were little more than road districts. Taxes were light, expectations were low, and government services were few and far between. Townships maintained hounds for stray animals. They paid bounties for the destruction of predatory animals like wolves. They put a head, you brought in a wolf's head, you got so much money. They supported the indigenous poor, educated poor children, and seasonally maintained roads. Now, so you understand what even that meant. You didn't maintain the road simply by paying your share of the tax. What happened is, under this neighborly system of doing business, a farmer generally worked off his road tax by showing up on a specified day with a shovel, a wagon, and a team of horses, and you worked on the highway, you repaired the local highways, and this had to be repeated every spring as the erosion and tore the roads up. Now, as early as 1693, the General Assembly of New Jersey allowed inhabitants to form a 3-member school committee to set the rate for the salary and maintenance of a schoolmaster for as long as they saw fit. Now, what that means is you could hire them for a month, 3 months, 6 months, whatever deal you could get. Once a majority of the inhabitants of the township agreed that this is what they were going to do, the remaining townsfolk were obligated to pay their share of the tax. Coalitions of interested parents thus negotiated all arrangements to educate their children in neighborhood schools, forming these informal boards of education. This is the very kernel of home rule. The sort of, you got together with parents in your neighborhood, let's build a schoolhouse here, and It's actually a form of government which remains distinct in New Jersey today. To this day, school districts are independently chartered government entities, distinct from the municipal government. We don't even vote on the budgets at the same time. Beginning in 1894, districts increasingly corresponded in their boundaries with the host municipality. For us, the inheritors of this system, school taxes usually far exceed municipal and county taxes. They actually today make up 55% on average of the New Jersey residents' tax bill, just schools. As the Associated Press reported on April 18, 2007, quote, New Jersey's reliance on property taxes to pay for schools is unusually high compared to other states. The control the state gives voters over local tax bills is also unusual compared with other states. Now I want to take you back in time. Go way back to the beginning here. For the longest time, the clergy were the only learned and professional class within the limits of Bergen County. And consequently, the first schools were directly or indirectly church schools. You can see the relationship exactly where we are standing. Describing the domestic and social habits of the Bergen Dutch, one historian in 1881 noted, quote, they brought their children up to habits of industry, just like we do. Almost every son was taught some mechanical art, and every daughter was required to become well acquainted with all knowledge necessary to housekeeping. Sounds sexist, but housekeeping in those days was probably worse than the mechanical arts that the men were dealing with, and required a great deal of skill, knowledge. So for the most part, there was a system of formal or informal apprenticeships that was your fundamental preparation for life. Whether you were a lawyer, a farmer, or a craftsperson. Even a lawyer, you would essentially enter the shop of a lawyer or the office of a lawyer and sort of learn by watching what he did. Interestingly, however, several educational historians maintain that adult white males in colonial America had a relatively high rate of literacy, ranging somewhere between 70 and 100%. I think that's astonishing, far higher than in England at the same time. Yeah?
Just talking about New Jersey or?
No, this is sort of the eastern seaboard. Actually, the highest rates of literacy were reported for New England, where the Puritans, and of course, remember there, under sort of the Protestant Reformation, your ability to read Scripture and to arrive at some direct understanding of what it meant was your key to salvation. So very high value placed on literacy. Now, you got to wait a minute and stop and think about this. The minute you throw in women, you're down to 50% at least of the population, or somewhere near there. And then when you begin considering African Americans, Native Americans, and things like this group begins to shrink in size. But still, 70 to 100% of adult white males essentially could read and write. Nonetheless, educational standards were lax or non-existent. School attendance was purely voluntary and for the common folk, always a secondary consideration to their pursuit of agriculture. Our first schools were largely private institutions operating upon tuition income, with the education of the poor left to charity. Some farmer would donate a convenient parcel of land, and local families contributed their labor to erect a small building and furnish it with a teacher, some rudimentary furniture, an outhouse, and fuel for winter sessions. Now, keeping to the agricultural calendar, older children usually went to school in winter and younger children in summer. Now, years ago, when my children were at Riverdale, they paid this high-priced consultant to come in and discuss, education curriculum. And the first thing she said is how absurd it was that our school year is based on the old agricultural calendar. We haven't been farmers in all these years. Say what? When do our kids go to school? September through June, during the harvest, and during the spring planting? This is not the agricultural calendar. Does anybody know what the calendar reflects?
Health problems, cholera and stuff.
In my hometown in Newton, they induced a shoe manufacturer named Henry Merriam to move his shoe factory into the town in 1872 on the promise that he wouldn't be dealing with all these immigrants from Europe who had come from a craft guild union background. So we were going to supply him with cheap, unorganized rural labor. They spent $15,000, built the shoe factory, and guess what happened? Nobody came to work. Let me get this right. You're going to pay me 10 cents a week or whatever. And I'm going to sit in this building for 10 hours a day for 6 days a week, and you want to pay me what? In a rural society, there was no training or regimentation to an industrial, discipline. So they built a second building in the town that looked exactly like the factory, big brick building with a slate roof. And what did schools become? You ring a bell in the morning, everybody does the same thing. You ring a bell at lunch, everybody goes to lunch. You ring a bell, boom, boom. In other words, the school system evolved to an industrial culture to habituate people to work in factories. And I think, I've never developed this thought, but if you progress through the 40s and 50s and 60s, and schools begin to look and operate like office parks, suburban office parks, and today, So I think they are very much more reflective of the culture we live in than most people suspect. The state of New Jersey took its first small step towards funding free schools in 1816 by investing $15,000 in bank and canal stocks to create a school trust fund. A small portion of state tax revenues was dedicated to this trust fund in 1818. Now what they did was let that fund essentially sit there for 10 years and accrue in value. And the first expenditure of income from this fund came in 1829 when $20,000 was annually appropriated and apportioned among the counties in the ratio that they paid taxes into the state treasury. This funding was primarily directed to schooling the indigent poor. You always find the word indigenous with poor. We don't know you. Go back where you came from. If you're not poor and living here, we don't school you, we don't deal with you. That was the mentality of that time. At annual township meetings, the inhabitants were authorized not only to elect a school committee to determine the number of scholars attending each of their common schools, but they had to determine the residency of these students, and it operated under what we would probably today call a voucher system. You lived across the river in Midland Township, your money came with you if you went to this school in this township. But also to raise additional funds by tax or other means for the support of the common schools. In other words, they said to the townships, you want to raise more money than we're giving you from the state, you go right ahead and you can do that. We're not going to make you do it, but you go ahead. In framing this system, no attempt was made to coerce the townships into raising any supplemental dollars, and it was left to the liberty, each was left to the liberty to tax itself or not for the purposes of education. Now, I always emphasize, when you're talking about education in this time frame, you are simply referring to literacy. We're not talking about any form of advanced education. No high schools in New Jersey until 1895. Of course, this schoolhouse where we meet today is a very charming reminder of rural days bygone. This one room where you're sitting was built to accommodate 89 students.
Simultaneously.
Yep, if necessary. The folk who erected the first schoolhouse in this neighborhood were cereal farmers, cereal grain farmers. That's what Bergen County originally was, a granary or bread basket county. That changed more suddenly than we can imagine, and I'll explain to you how. That changed on the winds of an economic revolution which swept farm and factory in the second quarter of the 19th century. With the opening of the Erie Canal, 1825, now listen to this, follow this example, which is from that period. With the opening of the Erie Canal, flour manufactured on the shores of Lake Erie was sold in New Bern, North Carolina, for $5.50 per barrel. It had been shipped through the Erie Canal from Lake Erie, down the Hudson River to New York City, and then by sea to North Carolina. It cost $2 to transport the same barrel of flour only 120 miles overland from Raleigh, North Carolina to New Bern, North Carolina. That guy, that farmer, 120 miles away, was out of business in competition with a farmer on the shores of Lake Erie, because that's how expensive overland transport was. And this was a much larger sum than was paid for freight from Lake Erie, over a distance of at least 1,200 miles. In other words, it was cheaper to ship a barrel of flour 1,200 miles than it was 120 miles. And in Bergen County, the grist mills closed, the grain fields went away, and we went to truck farming, specialized farming, fruit farming, vegetable farming, because you couldn't compete any longer. By 1850, Bergen County was described, quote, as one large strawberry patch. You have time later on, look at the strawberry baskets in the field racks back here. We shipped 1.5 million baskets of strawberry weekly, in season of course, to New York City in a stream of 1,100 wagons, if you can imagine this trailing into the city. And of course, the strawberry season, you know, is what, 2 or 3 weeks, you know. Of course, there were other things in strawberries, but I found it interesting because children were only let out of school for one holiday, Christmas, and the only other reason they were excused from school was, quote, children desiring to pick strawberries were excused, unquote. To give you some sense of the educational technology and facilities of that era, quote, going for water and passing it in calabashes or dippers as children sat on their benches was a coveted privilege in the schoolhouse. You ever seen a bottle gourd? Do you have one in the collection here? You ever see, we have them in the, I think we still have them. They're not in Newark Bay. You know, a bottle gourd, they would hollow out, and as a dipper, you would go out to the well, fill it, and then pass it down the school benches for everybody to have a drink of water. That was the technology of that time. The earliest reports from township superintendents in 1846 described one Bergen County school district where one teacher was assigned to 236 children. Not that they all would have been in class on any given day. In fact, only 108 of these ever attended school at all. So half, less than half. And with an average daily attendance of 56 out of 236 students of school age. Reporting on another large district with 176 children of school age, 8 attended school for 12 months, 7 for 9 months, 13 for 6 months, 34 went for 3 months, and 25 for less than 3 months. In other words, the vast majority of them were showing up in winter when there wasn't work to be done around on the house or the farm. That's all they went. I love this one. John Van Brunt, who was the town superintendent of Hackensack Township in 1867, so we're talking about Teaneck, Ridgefield Park, Pagoda, had to give his report. He simply said of the school-age children in his district, quote, they are educated somehow and somewhere. End of report, right? They didn't have the same emphasis on paperwork we have today, obviously. Now, what made the change? The Northern Railroad Company opened on October 1st, 1859, quote, running along the tableland of the Palisades, many portions of which it has been the means of redeeming from forests and converting into beautiful parks and villas, those horrible forests, you know. As the web of rails grew, so did the inducements to suburban commuters. The whistle of the Iron Horse sounded Bergen County's first real estate boom, and farmland began to diminish. This produced a great contest, political contest. The so-called old settlers, or pumpkin dusters, as they were fondly known, opposed the commuters out of fear of rising taxation for improvements that exclusively benefited these little railroad stop villages. You know why they call them pumpkin dusters? Well, imagine yourself on your commute to work on your train, and you see the farmer out in the field, they said, dusting frost off the pumpkins. So you can see these are groups with very different expectations. One, unfrosted pumpkins. The other, they want services. They want water, they want sewer, they want libraries, etc. Some feared such new financial devices as bonding, with its connotations of borrowing against the future and living in debt. Oh, we're going to bond and we're going to pave all the roads in Midland Township. Say what? You're going to go $15,000 into debt and we're going to pay. That wasn't the mentality of most farm families, see? So already you can see this divide growing. The divide was politicized as commuters identified with the Republican Party and many farmers clung to the Democratic Party, the old Jeffersonian Democratic Party. I always point out this, the polarity, the political polarity, reversed in the 1920s. And those who had been diehard Democrats almost all became Republicans. And I don't know, that would be an interesting topic in itself to find out why, but that did happen. Let me see here. The boundaries of a large majority of Bergen County school districts were set in 1873, the year after this building was built, and when the effects of railroads were only first being felt. And over the next 15 years, now imagine this kind of growth, the school population increased by 35% without any corresponding adjustments in township boundaries. And so the opening of new roads and avenues all the time made it more convenient for a great many children to attend school in the neighboring district. And hence, numerous applicants sought a change of the school boundaries. Longtime residents, fearing school improvements would raise their taxes, also used this excuse to seek a change in district lines. We don't mind if the Maywood school is cut out of our district because those folks over there, you know, they want to go to school 9 months a year. You know, we don't want to pay for that, you know. So there's feelings, strong feelings on both sides of this issue. According to the Bergen Democrat on April 26, 1889, quote, much of the new element, meaning commuters, much of the new element to the school census comes from the city. And these parents object to their children walking so far and therefore ask for a division of the district. God forbid you had to walk to a muddy field, you know, to school. I met an old guy up by Waterloo Village years ago who told me when he was a kid, he had to go across the river into Morris County to school, and every year the school board bought him a new pair of shoes. Practical solution. Now you have to stop here, and I have to give you just a little bit of a refresher in economic history. This is all beginning to happen about the time of the Civil War. The railroads are coming, the population is starting to escalate, suburban settlement. As we know, growth always has consequences, and unplanned growth even more so. The Civil War raised industry and high finance to a scale capable of fielding vast armies over half a continent. Stop and think of a little rural country like America, the North just industrializing, and you're going to put in the field 1 million men and feed and clothe them over half a continent. The Civil War changed America in ways that that generation never would have anticipated or expected. Steam power gave birth to large mechanized factories dependent on an urban population for a steady supply of operatives. A steel web of railroads moved raw materials and finished goods in a national marketplace, not in a little local economy anymore. And with giant corporations, holding companies, combinations, and trusts increasingly dominating the economy. The economy was overheated, almost feverish in the summer of 1873. Workmen, quote, carried pockets full of greenbacks, lived luxuriously, and shouted for Grant, who was the president. Young men without means purchased farms at exorbitant prices. The bubble burst when J. Cook and Company, the government's preferred bankers, failed in September of 1873, bringing general ruin in their wake. Widespread economic stagnation settled on the country, causing an unprecedented shrinkage of values and bankruptcy among the manufacturing, farming, and producing classes. Farms in Sussex County were so devalued in 1873 that they did not reach the same price per acre until 1973. Imagine that. Within a short span of months, factories stopped, laborers went tramping about begging for bread, land depreciated in value from 30 to 50% and was being sold under the sheriff's hammer. What is the main base of funding services in schools? Property taxes, which plummet 50%. Observers watched with dismay as farms, quote, farms in the surrounding country are cheaper now than for many years past, and when sales are made, it is often at prices far below the assessed value. Before the economy staggered back to its feet, the Long Depression, as it was called, winnowed outmoded industries and drained many old channels of commerce. Savings banks, now those of you who've been around since the 80s and whatnot, savings banks disastrously failed in record numbers during the spring of 1878, followed by national banks in June 1878. Now we've been through this cycle of boom and bust ourselves. People don't pay their mortgage. It wasn't until 1879 that businesses took an upward turn, as one observer noted, quote, miles of moving railway trains, the hum of machinery, long processions of mechanics, artisans, and laborers, rested and ready at the shrill call of the time whistle, all betoken the very presence of the long-expected good time. Good times are back. Then and now, New Jersey differs from most other states in its heavy reliance on real estate property taxes to fund municipalities, counties, and school districts. The property tax actually evolves from colonial land taxes. And those of you who have ever sort of peered around old documents, you've seen those tax assessor lists for the township, how many horses you own, how many improved acres, unimproved acres, that's your property tax bill. All right. After 1851, they actually added intangible property, which means stocks and bonds. Before that, you could hide a lot of money that way. So what happens here is, this is pretty startling when you think about property taxes. This panic of 1873, the devaluation of industrial and agricultural lands in New Jersey went from, the valuation went from $619 million in 1874 to $509 million in 1879. That's how staggering a decline this was. The city of Elizabeth went bankrupt. Municipalities were declaring bankruptcy left and right because their tax base was gone. Now this is coming at the same time municipalities are expanding services. Well, we want more schools. We want better schools. So in 1884, now does this sound familiar? In 1884, the state created a railroad tax for the first time that raised $952,000 in that first year. And they created a corporate tax that raised $98,000. These two taxes now paid all state taxes, including the school fund, just those taxes. And they were able, from 1882 to 1920, to give all of the property taxes to municipalities. And that's why to this day, the property tax is really the foundation of municipal, county, and school district taxing. This was to stave off bankruptcy, municipal bankruptcies in the 1880s. Now, it was after 1894 that they passed the Township School Act, which I'll discuss in a minute, that population growth really came to Bergen County. And that's the important thing to understand here. When they changed this township school law, and I'll explain what that meant in a minute, all of a sudden, the population exploded. So whatever this change was, brought the commuters in record numbers. But residents, what happened was, the new school act consolidated large rural school districts and made each township or municipality its own self-contained school district. No more of this cross the river type of thing. But residents, when this happened, were compelled to pay off the debts of the old districts on a pro-rata basis. For some reason, and this is a quote, they exempted boroughs, towns, villages, and cities from the law. So guess what happened? 26 boroughs were formed in Bergen County in that year alone. The federal census of 1900 was the last of its kind to classify a majority of Bergen County population as rural. And in 1900, 59.8% were still rural, or still farmers. And there was no stopping the train once they did pass this act, because the pattern of forming new communities persisted almost yearly until 1924, by which time all of the present 70 municipalities were in existence in Bergen County. 56 boroughs, 3 cities, 2 villages, and 9 townships. Bergen County is very much the right place to discuss home rule. As the Patterson Guardian said in June 1890, quote, Bergen County is the isolated representative of New Jersey's 21 counties that has gone into the wholesale borough business, and the lawyers look upon it as a good thing. The editor of the Bergen Index thought that 16 townships of Bergen County had been, quote, visited by an epidemic, which there is no resisting. It attacks a village first as a murmuring complaint. In the later stages of the attack, the case is hopeless. It inevitably results in amputating the affected part of the township from its township connection. Sometimes an eruption of embryo officials mark the disease through its course. At other times, a selfish antipathy to being taxed for other people is observed. In either case, the election of a mayor and other municipal functionaries generally had, quote, a very soothing effect. But over the span of 17 months, Bergen County townships were boroughized to death. Now, stop for a minute and we'll think about the Township School Law of 1894, which was really the source of ignition for what happened here. What they were trying to do, and doesn't this sound familiar? You're all familiar with the Abbott districts, correct? The purpose of the school, the Township School Law of 1894, was to equalize educational opportunities among poorer or richer rural or suburban school districts. It provided for consolidation of all the school districts within any township into a single district to be managed by a 9-member Board of Education. And here's the key. Each city, borough, and incorporated town was to become its own school district. County superintendents then were to apportion the state school money to each of these districts under a fair fee. And the editor of the Hackensack Republican surmised some schools will fare well under this division, while others will not do so well. This, I think, is interesting. You're familiar with Francis Westervelt's 1923 History of Bergen County? Well, a man named Benjamin Worcester in that writes a very interesting article on public education. And this is quoted directly from him. Quote, he's speaking now of this 1894 Township School Law. Its main purpose was to equalize educational opportunity so that children in a poor section might get some of the advantages given to children in richer districts of a township. Doesn't that sound familiar? But in Bergen County, this attempt was a failure. The richer districts were unwilling to share their funds with their neighbors, and advantage was taken of the Borough Act, which permitted portions of a township to become separate municipalities with municipal and school governments of their own. And then he goes on to mention that once it was passed, 26 boroughs were formed, and in Bergen County alone in that year, and scarcely a year has passed that we failed to add another one. I'd like to, I want to conclude by talking about this particular school in just a minute, but I thought just to give you a little bit more perspective closer to our own time. As you would expect, the school tax was increasing over time. In 1903, the school tax increased to 2 3/4 mils on each dollar of property value to fund more and better schools. And then I found this commission. Now, you had to be a historian to find something like this, right? The Commission for the Survey of Municipal Financing in 1916. Listen to this, though. Quote, "The funded debt of New Jersey municipalities has doubled in a decade. The costs of administration have increased 2.5 times in that same period. The ever-increasing demands for services will bring constantly increased tax burdens." This sounds like it was written 6 months ago. And you can follow the trail of complaints right down to our own time. Professor Edwin Seligman wrote in the Trenton Times in 1930 that New Jersey communities place too great a reliance on property taxes. He concluded, quote, "The revenues are inadequate, the methods are slipshod, and the system is outworn." By 1935, New Jersey was second among the states in combined state and local debt per capita. So this seems to be a problem that has quite a lineage here. Skipping decades ahead, we learn that over 100 school budgets were defeated in 1963, based in part upon the real estate taxes for education. Now, I want to conclude it by talking about this building in Ridgewood, because I think this building is an illustration, in physical fact, of what we've been talking about here. Educational historian Benjamin Worcester thought, quote, "Probably the first school in the present limits of Bergen County was at Paramus near the old Reformed church and was built about 1730. So not this building, but somewhere in this immediate precinct, it was probably the first schoolhouse of record built in Bergen County. This particular building that we're sitting in was built in 1872 at a cost of $4,600. It served Public School District 45 until 1905. When it was built, there was actually a disagreement with the church over the privileges, which led to a search of the records to see whether or not provision for a school was included in Mrs. Valieur's in her original land grant to the church. They never found anything. But the trustees of the church decided this has been going on for so long that we have to give you, I think they gave them a free lease in perpetuity for the ground on which the school was built. They just sort of said, go ahead. So the very origin of this school district is actually lost in the midst of time and lore. That's how old this form of home rule, in a sense, is. In 1876, District 45 spanned the Saddle River, taking in portions of Hohokus, Ridgewood, Washington, and Midland townships. 4 townships, pieces of 4 townships are sending children here. Now, the schoolhouse was raised a year after the state legislature established a free public school system, forbade state aid to any private school, that was in 1871, and compelled all townships to have a 9-month school term. For the first time, your kids got to go for 9 months. The state school tax, and that's why they had to build this building. The state school tax of 1871 was 2 mils on the dollar, and prior to this, there was no recognized state obligation for the support of free schools whatsoever. This obligation was strengthened by state constitutional amendments in 1878 And see if these words are familiar to you. I quote, which required the state to support, quote, a thorough and efficient system of free public schools for the instruction of all children between the ages of 5 and 18 years. These are the exact same words that are driving the discussions today. Thorough and efficient system of free public schools. And I have the great honor of knowing who wrote those words. He was a judge named Swayze, who lived in the town of Newton, my hometown of Newton. They found years ago a plaque abandoned in the Department of Education in Trenton, honoring him for coming up with this obligation of the state. Now, what happened? On September 6, 1894, the Hackensack Republican, now remember we have the Township School Act of 1894, and what you want to do if you want to form a new borough, you want to find the schoolhouse, and you want to get that in the limits of your town. Then you don't have to build a new schoolhouse, and the guy that you cut off across the river, they got to raise the money and build a new schoolhouse. So all of a sudden, the Hackensack Republican reports in September 6, 1894, that there were movements to create the boroughs of Undercliff, which is Hohokus, East Ridgewood, out of parts of Ridgewood, Orville, and Washington townships. Now, they said these movements temporarily balked. They died. And if these schemes had succeeded, then Ridgewood Township would have been reduced to Ridgewood Village and old Bob Lewis's Spiker Town. I don't know where Spiker Town is or was, but they would have cut all the schools out of Ridgewood and left Ridgewood without a school of its own. In response, Ridgewood citizens were determined, quote, to check the crazy borough rush, and they called a meeting for September 4th, 1894, to promote incorporation under the Winton Village Act. These names might mean more to you than they do to me, but Milton Richardson was the editor of the Boot and Shoe Weekly here in Ridgewood. Dr. E.F. Hanks, Postmaster J.F. Crane, and Joseph F. Kerrigan spearheaded the movement. Of course, they got their lawyer down to Hackensack the following morning, before anybody else could create a borough overnight. It was felt that residents would, quote, be found almost or quite unanimous in favor of this movement, as not less than 130 taxpayers, representing $380,000 of valuation, signed the petition. You only needed 1/5. And if you're interested, the total valuation of Ridgewood Township at that time was $1 million. It was felt that village incorporation would save the populous portion of the original township from dismembership and absorption in woodchuck boroughs. The great joke at that time was the pun on a borough would appear in a farm field out of nowhere overnight, and of course they attributed these to woodchucks digging burrows, in the dark. So that's why they called them woodchuck burrows. And also, you can see it's a jab at the pumpkin dusters, you see. On September 22nd, 1894, the Bergen Index concluded that the people of Orville and Saddle River townships were, quote, attempting to overcome the objectionable features of the new school law by resolving themselves into boroughs following the old school district lines. They were all trying to get to the schoolhouse and incorporate a borough around it before their neighbors could steal it from them. At the Ridgewood election on November 15, 1894, 277 voted for village incorporation and 62 against. Imagine that, 277 for, 62 against, and that's what created a separate municipality here. Consequently, the Republican correspondent remarked, quote, to all intents and purposes, Ridgewood Township is obliterated. The Paramus School, where we're sitting, immediately became a bone of contention between Orville and Ridgewood Village, since Orville Township built the building and maintained it until the enactment of the new consolidated school law, by which Ridgewood simply absorbed it. So the people who built it were left out. Orville Township still assisted with the maintenance of the school, but was compelled to pay tuition for pupils who, living in that neighborhood, naturally continued to attend school, attend their own local school. So hopefully that will give you a sort of little bit of perspective and a specific illustration of where we originate with town, with home rule. I do have other examples, and I will post this on the website. Another fascinating story that may interest you is the Hackensack Waterworks. That's a building, of course, of interest in preserving today. That was also the source of ignition for one of the fuels that drove the borough movement. Are you familiar, if you go across the bridge there into New Milford, there's a little village sort of called Petersburg on the east side of the river in New Milford. Petersburg was settled by largely by German immigrants. The developer's name was Gustav Peetz. And in 1893, they decided that the village had grown large enough, they wanted to build their own school. So they had a district election, but the district election included what's now Oradell on the west side of the river. And they being more populous, they won. They built the school on their side of the river. And of course, the largest tax rateable was the Hackensack Waterworks. So the people of Oradell got together and overnight filed papers, created a borough that took in only one slice of the east side of the river, and that was the Hackensack Waterworks. And showed up, had an election, and oh, well, it's ours. We got the biggest tax rateable in the neighborhood. Well, Petersburg, as you can imagine, they were incensed at this, and the presiding judge in Hackensack said, oh, or you can't do this. You can't, what Oradell did is not allowed because they took in a piece of another township. The borough, as far as we know, the Borough Act says you can carve your little town out of a township but not cross lines. They went to the legislature. And in the great wisdom of the legislature decided, not only will we allow you to do this, but if you do it, we'll give you your own freeholder on the County Board of Freeholders. In 6 months, the County Board of Freeholders went from 16 to 25 freeholders. Everybody immediately ran to form a town, even if you just took a little slice, hopefully a good rateable, out of the next guy's township, you got yourself. And this is why today, I think it was 1911, because of Bergen County, they went to the freeholder elected at large, the small board, I can't remember, it was 7 or 9 members, depending on what class county you were in 1911. And that was, again, spawned by this fight over a schoolhouse in Oradell. So I'll post this on the web if you want to sort of read it in more detail. It's a very interesting question. Those distinctions are still preserved. Teaneck is a township. Ridgefield Park, I believe, and Ridgewood are villages. River Edge is a borough. And I think, I'm not totally up to date on it, and I probably know more about it in the 1860s than I do present time, but I think it has to do with the actual form of government. A township has a township committee, and the committee, I think, elects one of its own as a mayor. Whereas in a borough, you elect a mayor and an assessor and councilmen. So it has to do with the size of the governing body and who elects the mayor. And, other than that, I don't think there's tremendously much distinctions anymore. Newton became a village in 1864 purely because it enabled them to be their own road district. And what that simply meant, and my guess is this may have influenced here a little bit, Newton was a town, and the only town, small town, of course, at that time, maybe 500 people, in the middle of a farming country. When you had your road taxes, well, they were spread out over miles of rocky, muddy roads, and the people of Newton wanted paved streets and sidewalks. So by forming a village, they created their own road district, in a sense, and spent all of the money raised in the town simply on their own streets and sidewalks. It probably also had to deal with, perhaps in with what percentage of the valuation of property you had to have represented on your petition to have the election to become it. Maybe it was a lower threshold if you went for a township as opposed to a borough or a village. Because they were rumps of larger townships. South Hackensack, which is like the little piece of Lodi, by Lodi, and the piece over by South Hackensack, were just pieces that were literally left out of the other boroughs as they chewed it up because they were farm fields or they had nothing of value to contribute. And a lot of those people begged, you can't leave us without a school, or you can't leave us without rateables, or you can't, but they did. And there's a lot of little incidences of boundary adjustments because this was done literally overnight in many cases. For example, I think it was 1913, Oradell and River Edge adjusted their boundary because they ran it originally down the middle of Midland Avenue. Well, who's going to pave it? Who's going to plow it? So years later, they decided, well, and that's why today you have one course of house lots on the north side of Midland Avenue were added to River Edge, so that River Edge got the responsibility for solely for maintaining Midland Avenue. And another one, which a developer tried to pull, who was also a political party boss at that time, I think his name was Heck. He owned a farm on the edge of Emerson, which I think, I'm not positive of this, but I think that's where they're rebuilding that strip mall on the sort of the left side as you're going north of Kinnicamack Road. He tried to get that removed from Emerson and added to Westwood, I think it was, to get the benefits of the sewer or water or whatever connection it was. So there were always chicanery, going on. The idea was, I forget what the percentage was, maybe I read it here, say you had to get taxpayers representing 1/5 of the total valuation of the area you wanted to incorporate as a borough. So you could literally influence the outcome of the election. Now, remember, in some of these elections, you're talking about 39 people for, 8 against. So all you have to do is literally draw the lines. Well, I know Bob over there, he got dirt on his shoes with this. And of course, the craziest one of all, which didn't exist for more than 2 years, I think it was Eastwood. And what was happening was, remember when I explained with Oradell, if you created a borough out of pieces of 2 townships, you got a freeholder on the county board. Well, then what happens, how do you maintain political balance between the 2 parties? You go to an area where you see, well, let's see, we have 95 Democratic voters here, and there are 16 Republicans on this side of the town, so we'll just draw this boundary and we'll take their schoolhouse while we're at it. And you see, and that's how Eastwood was created, to balance off. I think they created Hillsdale, which added a Republican freeholder to the board. So immediately they created Eastwood, put a Democrat to keep the balance of power. Well, again, it's another toughie, but it didn't work. You wouldn't think a system like this would work to the advantage of most populations. It is, as we now know today, extremely expensive. And in 1894, people said, whoa, do you have any idea? One guy, I don't have the quote in front of me, but came out in the newspaper and said, they've created 300 new municipal officials in 1 year. You see what I mean? You can sort of be the mayor of your own town if you find a lawyer and draw a line quick enough. And that's why the legislature changed it a year later. But of course, what they changed it to, they said, now only the legislature can create a new borough. Well, you know what that did? The political bosses all headed to Trenton, and they just continued to do the same thing. But my guess is, I have tried to look on the web. It's a very difficult thing to sort of prove, but if you look at different places where you suspect there might be a competition for the honor, and base the number of municipalities on sort of square miles, at least not yet, I have not found another one. And certainly within New Jersey, There's not another county that reached the extreme that it did in Bergen County. Well, they created those counties in the 19th century. So the counties themselves may have been, they were subtracted from other counties. And there certainly, I think, was some boroughization. The late Speaker of the Assembly, Alan Karcher, wrote a book called Municipal Madness, I think it's called, where he sort of gives you more of a view than I do of the whole state. But
what was the last community formed in Bergen?
I think it was Rockley.
I read it in 1924 date, and I got a book that says 27, but I understand Rodney says that the date they voted and the date the state legislature was separated.
I think that, there's some discrepancy. I'm not sure. There were several in 1923. Rockley, New Milford, which I believe is I think New Milford's a borough, but I'm not sure. It's a borough. There were a couple in 23, and that's really where it sort of
Was that when it split off from Oroville? I think.
No, it was the rump, again, of a rural township. And to show you the humor of this, if there is any humor in it, I was looking at this little fact, which is sort of floating in the middle of nowhere. In 1950, Paramus had a population of 6,268 people. 10 years later, it increased by 270% to 23,238 people. Now stop and think about this. Paramus was left as the farming rump of Midland Township. The little railroad commuter cities of Oradell and River Edge and Maywood all seceded and left the farmers to their black dirt celery farms. And what happened in 1950? You want to build a mall, you're not going to build it in the middle of Oradell, you're going to build it on the open farm fields. So all of a sudden Paramus ends up at the intersection of the major highways with these huge ratables to support its schools. And who's left out in terms of commercial ratables? These little railroad station towns. So I guess that's the famous saying, be careful what you ask for, because eventually you might get it. Yeah. As early as 1895, I think, and I'm sure Ridgewood historians would know more about this than I do, they built a 3-story brick school in Ridgewood. Probably, more serviceable to the people who were living near the railroad station.
That's the part that I'm confused about, because it seems to me that in 1894 they were already ready, they were already in process with the Beach Street School, and I don't know how they got a jump on.
Well, that's why Glen Rock and Midland Park pulled out, and why Undercliff and
Right.
the other one were thinking of pulling out, and
They didn't want to pay
said,
for that.
we gotta keep all these other
Right.
people here to pay for this big school.
I don't know how they had the vision to, I don't know how they had the vision to make
Well, part of it again is this culture, because believe it or not, if you're ever in Vernon, Sussex County, that you go visit the Price Switch School, which was a one-room schoolhouse that closed in 1958.
So still in use up until that?
1958. And there were ones in Burlington County that were, I think, a few years beyond that. And it just has to do, my guess is this was on the outskirts of town. It was probably still servicing people from Orville Township or a farming. And your question goes to the very heart of the question of home rule. Because what is the fundamental way that most of us have a sense of community? Through the school. So my guess is, in most cases, schools are fundamental to the way and that's why I think we figured this out. So I think people who had a sort of sense of neighborhood, and remember in those times, and coming from, they didn't call us Hicks, they called us Hoopies. You know what a Hoopie is? Up in Sussex County, in the spring, the rural folk, the mountain folk, would spend all winter making hickory splint baskets and harvesting hoop poles for barrels. And the first time the roads dried out in spring, they'd come down to the railroad station out of the mountain with a wagon load of hoops and baskets to sell on the train. And so rural people were called hoopies, not hicks. And now, I mean, I saw the best of both worlds. Maybe this answers your question in the sense that my father was literally descended from the first Dutch and English who settled in Sussex County, but my mother was Irish Catholic from Leonia. And so I was an insider and an outsider. You could see it from both perspectives. But when I grew up, even in a fairly rural, last time there were literally more cows than people in Sussex County was 1954, and I was 2 years old. So the thing is, if you go back to that type of a world, if you've ever lived in that, I was related to half the people in the county. You know, if you got on a bike and rode across Sussex County, you didn't worry, because if somebody didn't know you, they knew your uncle, they knew your grandfather, your great-grandfather. You know, the only thing you had to worry about was whether you owed money to any of them. You know? So that's a very different sense of community than a community of people who have come together because there's a convenient railroad station. Of course, over time, that sense of community develops. People intermarry, form social networks and things like that. But I think that, I bet you a study would be interesting, would be to go to the Beach Street School. And I think what you would find is the people who were building that school did not build a one-room schoolhouse. Their expectations were entirely different. So I'm sure that they looked at this as temporary until we can do better or consolidate and do more, right? And if you go into cities like Newark and or even smaller towns like Newton, you will find impressive school buildings, a lot more impressive than this, built in the 1860s and 70s. It all depends on how you value education. And of course, with a rising industrial class, if you wanted your son or daughter, to be a clerk, or your daughter to be a stenographer or whatever it was, that's why high schools appeared in the 1890s. Before that, you wanted to go beyond reading, writing, arithmetic, you paid for it yourself.
But the Jersey City Library, I mean, you look at it, it's dirty. I mean, it's really ornate.
And I would predict, what predictions are worth, and I won't be here to say, I won't put a wager on it, but I'll bet you if the same progression follows, let's say 15 or 20 years from now, a college education will also be paid for the same way that a high school education is paid for. Because, I mean, even when my mother went to NJC, Douglas College, to become a teacher, very few women of her generation got a college education. Today, it's thought of the same way a BA today as a high school diploma was even when I was perhaps a kid. So I'll bet you as the expectations rise, so does the social obligation. Oh, well, you have to go to college now to get a job, so we're going to have to pay for everybody to go to college. One of the pieces I put up was in 1889, where a newspaper reporter said, what happened? Every house looked the same. It was Center Hall with so many windows at each side, everything was painted the same color. Now all of a sudden, the houses are all irregular shapes, weird colors, The whole culture just sort of changed, and part of that, even that you see in this building, but which you certainly see in the architecture of Ridgewood or any other town, is people wanted to create a cultural past. And in Bergen County in the farming era, there were no Roman ruins or, Gothic churches, so they created a past by, you walk down the street and here's a Jacobean house, and here's and the layering of it, one next to another in contrast, immediately created this sense of, well, we are a civilization that has roots that are thousands of years old, like Europe, but we're not. It's all a facade. A man I've mentioned once, Gustav Pietz, who was a German contractor and developer. And the square of Maywood is the square of land that Pietz bought and laid out into town plots. He did the same thing in the development I live in River Edge, and he did the same thing in Pittsburgh and New Milford. He just went from one railroad station to the next, and that's why essentially what you do is his land, subdivision, is what's now the town. That's how intimate those things are connected.
That town remained German for many, many years, up through World War II.
Well, there was a very strong layering or influx of Germans all over the county in the up to about 1910 or so, around that era. You go over to again the Pittsburgh section, see the Germania Fire Company, or very powerful, you know. And my grandmother, who I grew up with, her best friend in Leonia was a Mrs. Adler, I think her name was. I very vaguely remember her, but she had a little delicatessen, German delicatessen pickle barrel and stuff. But they smashed all the windows in her store. World War I broke out, the anti-German feeling, and I remember them. That's when they changed the name of German Valley to Long Valley, and sauerkraut became. Oh yeah, they were born in this country.
Well, this guy wasn't a citizen.
Oh yeah, so there were. We've been through that through many different wars.
And Liberty Cabbage, right?
Liberty Cabbage, right? I'm sorry.
Oh, that's great. Would you like to comment on what you think the success will be of the current discussion about consolidation and regionalization? vis-a-vis-
Well, let me see.
Yeah.
It says not sure. No, the only thing I can tell you about that, I won't try to, is it called prognosticate on this, but what you have to sort of remember is, and this is why I like history so much, when you read back in time and you see people in 1916, 1903, 1884 talking about the exact same issue, there seems to be a pretty consistent way, which tells me that people want somehow, truly want what they have in their communities. They just don't want to pay for it. You see what I mean? And, you know, that dichotomy can go so far, and you say, oh my God, you know, I can't pay anymore, so we have to change things. But
And they resist regionalizing.
and they resist. And that's why I think in a larger context of a symposium, I would have loved to have had the people involved. I don't know the circumstances, so I don't want to say it, but I think the one mayor up here, they practically recalled, you know. I'll tell you one thing that, and you could, let me just pass this thought for a moment. I think, and this could be, I won't characterize this or good or as good or bad, but there has essentially been a disconnection in the tiering of government. Now, most of us here, I don't think anybody was born here after 1964, I think it was. When they went to, if you think, what was the New Jersey plan for the United States government, you know? Everybody thinks Virginia originated states' rights. Virginia had nothing to do with states' rights because Virginia was a large populated state. New Jersey created states' rights because it was a small state. And at the moment the Constitutional Convention was meeting, New Yorkers were building a New York lighthouse on Sandy Hook without permission from the state of New Jersey. Well, a little inconvenient truth, you see. So New Jersey went into the Constitutional Convention and said, wait a minute. If every state is not represented equally in the federal government, regardless of population size, we're not joining. And of course, it was Connecticut who gets the credit for the compromise because Connecticut said, well, let's have it both ways. We'll have one house where you're represented, 2 senators every state, whether you're in Rhode Island or Utah. And, of course, a population-based house. New Jersey had the same thing. Every county sent 2 state senators to the upper house. So the county government was represented in Trenton. Now, in 1964, when they ruled one vote, you know, every vote counts equally, now Bergen County is not, as a political entity, represented in Trenton in the upper house. So you can talk about regionalization, but to me, in some sense, it sort of dead ends, doesn't it? Because you can say the county should be the agency to be sort of the regional power of regionalization, but Bergen County is not exclusively represented in Trenton. its electoral districts may cross into other counties. You see what I mean? Now, I'm not saying that's good or bad. I certainly believe in one man, one vote. But I think there is one reason why, and that had a profound change in New Jersey politics, because up until that point, and people I don't think realize how profound a change, for most of up until the 1950s and 60s, rural counties could counteract in the Senate, state Senate, the industrialized, populated eastern counties. And so you had this sort of stalemate, and that meant you had rural New Jersey and urban New Jersey. Once you lost that balance, boom. Now you can drive out Sussex County and you think you're in Saddle River. There's no, you see what I mean? So that had profound consequences, I think. And I'm not saying the old system was better, but I think that's one of the reasons that you have to sort of look at this in a historical perspective and take a big view of it to think, well, what are we willing to tinker with and what aren't we willing to tinker with and how much will it cost? They certainly didn't do that in 1894 is, I guess, my summary point. You know what, I have a suspicion, and again, I can't prove this. You know, I was one time in a little sort of pastry shop. Well, I don't want to say where it was, but we were just, my wife and I sitting having coffee and some pastry for breakfast, and in walks the owner's brother, who was local policeman. You see? And you quickly begin to realize this is not an abstract discussion. When you talk about consolidating police departments and fire departments, you're talking about, well, Joe lives across, oh my God, our kid's place, oh, you know, that's my brother, that's, it all politics is local, and all local politics is personal. And my guess is that's why all these things are so tough. Your consolidation is somebody else's job elimination, and somebody, you see, that's what makes it tough. Well, the papers are filled with warnings and reactions of, I mean, when you read subtly, even in this woodchuck burrow craze, epidemic, that's the way that people characterized it. But both sides of the argument saw the benefits in it. Well, if they can do it to us, watch this. We're going to kick out your school so we don't have to pay for it.
It sounds like 30 years later, the Civil War all over again, all local bases.
That's why we're sitting here today. I mean, 103 years later, this topic is just as fresh as, you know, in 1894, it's the topic that's absorbed the legislature for a year, and most of the it's the #1 topic of interest, you know, in the states. And I hope that's what you take from this, is that there's nothing new under the sun. And lastly, the enormous value of history, that this is not nostalgia. This should be the prime subject of interest in our schools, because this tells, you want to know where you're going, see where you've been. Because the connections are just stunning, you know, when you go through it. Yeah.
It's not illegal. And the others.
And those are the famous last words.
And that was about it. I couldn't get anybody else to even flesh out that answer a little bit. That was it. And of course, they were the people in power, and we have the same thing today.
Okay. I'll leave you with this pearl of wisdom. When you look to Trenton on this issue, just remember, all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. Please, before you leave, this is one of the finest museums in the county. Be sure you see the rest of it. There's some upstairs. We highly value membership in the County Historical Society. If you're not a member, please be one. These are membership blanks. And these are little bookmarks that give our web site. The website has on it, and you can go home and read it, my series I did in 1994 called Pumpkin Duster. And what we're going to try to do on this fall, I hope to have it by today, but we haven't, The Pumpkin Duster article has a fifth part, I think going from 1896 forward to the 1920s, that covers the rest of the boroughization of the county. And I'd like to publish all of the 4 preceding parts with the unpublished fifth part in a book, and hopefully we'll have that available to you. But you can read the first 4 parts on our webpage, right? And join our message board.
Is your talk,
I will put this talk on it.